Hello, my name is Jordan Bedford, and I am creating a research study involving false news warnings and whether or not those fact-checked warnings and false news warnings have an impact on the spread of misinformation, or if they just further increase the mistrust in our news media. The study will involve looking at correlations between a variety of news media sources and also the perceptions of consumers of the news media. It looks to see if there is a correlation between the hours of weekly consumption of news media and if that affects the perceived bias of certain news media outlets. It also looks to question if fact-check sources affect an individual's perception of the credibility of an article title. And it also wants to look to see if self-reported political leanings have an effect on the perception of bias in news sources. Briefly, to look at a few articles that touch on the same topic of fake news, false news, fact-checking, and political bias. Here are a few articles. One being prior exposure increasing perceived accuracy of fake news. In this particular study, 938 participants were randomized into two groups. One group was shown warnings from a third-party fact check, and the other was not. And then they were asked if they would share those article titles, and it was shown that those warnings actually decreased the likelihood of the falsified articles to be shared via social media. For the article of no evidence for ideological asymmetry and dissonance avoidance, there was 452 participants that were recruited, and they were told that it was a social judgments and decisions study, and they were asked to juxtapose between two different political candidates, whether it was Obama and George Bush or Reagan and Bill Clinton. This was a repeat study of a previous experiment, and there was no support found in this attempt to replicate replicate for the same results, showing that there are any conservatives or liberals having more dissonance arousing avoidance to certain situations. In the article, we only believe in news that we have doctored for ourselves. 1,000 participants were shown falsified news headlines across the political spectrum. And it was shown that pro-government fake news was more plausible for right-wing people, while anti-government news, fake news, was found to be more credible for left-wing supporters. And then the participants were asked to rate the articles on a 1 to 7 scale, with 1 being absolutely not probable and 7 being very probable. The results were not able to establish whether the support for government or anti-government were the causes of believing in fake news, or if they co-occurred because of other factors. The research was able to identify traps of political wishful thinking, but they couldn't establish a direct cause correlation. So while previous studies have shown a decrease in the likelihood of an article being shared with a false news warning in front of it, I'm wondering and wish to look to see if the source of a fact check poses whether or not an article seems to be more believable or less credible due to the source of said fact check, and if it also has to do with the source aligning with an individual's personal political leanings. So the variables I'm looking to independently would be false news warnings and the fact check source that they do or do not have on them, and then looking to see how people respond based on their perception of the bias of those news sources. And I believe that the fact-checking sources presented will impact the believability of articles, especially in the event that the fact-check source differs from the individual's personal political leanings. For participants, I'm looking to recruit a minimum of 100 individuals, primarily UAFS students, psychology students, as well as political science students. I'm hoping to reach out to both the Republican and Democratic clubs on campus, and I will be reaching out on social media to see, especially primarily Facebook, to get people to try to click the link to fill out the survey and participate. Age range is most likely expected to be between the ages of 17 and 80, and I project a relatively even distribution between the genders as far as demographics. The materials will include a survey, primarily the Likert scale. It will ask to self-report personal political leanings from far left, moderate, right, as well as a self-respondence to weekly hours of news consumption. Participants will be asked to rate the perceived bias leanings of a variety of news media sources, as well as to rate the trustworthiness of said news media sources, and then be presented with articles that have been some altered, some falsified, some directly from the news, with a variety of fact-check sources applied, and then asked to assess and rate the trustworthiness based on the article title and the article fact-check source. Procedures will be relatively simple and straightforward. After a participant has agreed to participate, they will be directed to an online survey site, complete the consent form, and then continue on to the study, and they will fill out on their own accord without any input or influence, and be asked to answer the questions honestly and truthfully. There will also be a short demographic portion of the survey as well. So for my first analysis of correlation, it will be strictly between the hours of news media consumed and then the perceived political bias of a list of news media sites. Participants will be asked to answer one of the four groups: 0 to under an hour of news consumption a week, 2 to 5 hours a week, 6 to 9 hours a week, and more than 10 hours a week. Just to look to see if there is a more extreme response in an individual who consumes more than 10 hours of news a week, and how they perceive some of the news media sites versus someone who only watches maybe 2 or 3 hours of news media or consumes 2 to 3 hours of news media a week. This has nothing to do with whether or not the individual finds themselves to be more left or right leaning, but that could also be factored in how certain demographics may perceive the news based on their personal belief systems. Kind of what I was touching on before. Our second analysis is going to look at any correlations between the political leanings of an individual that they say that they are, and then their perception of the trustworthiness, not the political leaning, but the actual trustworthiness of the news media. So individuals, they will grade themselves versus for far left, moderate left, moderate right, far right, and then they will also the very similar, actually the same list of news media that they have been provided for the perception of the leanings. They will be asked the trustworthiness of said news media, and Pearson's R will be what is used to determine if there's any significance in those correlations. And finally, correlation between the believability of an article title with and without fact check sources listed. This is going to include there might be an article posted by CNN that was simply fact checked by Facebook, or fact checked by Fox News, fact checked, to see if the leanings of the individual, say that there's looking at if there is a correlation between the political leanings of an individual and whether or not they are trusting and willing to believe a fact check from a source that might be perceived to differ greatly from their ideology. An individual who self-describes as far left sees an article that is then fact-checked by InfoWars, and if that plays any part, even if the article itself seems believable or unbelievable, if the fact that this source that varies extremely differently from their own personal political views, does that have any impact on whether or not they question whether or not that is actually true? So using, again, Pearson's R, that's kind of the setup that we'll be looking for to see if there's any correlation in this particular part of the analysis. So with my study simply being correlation, it's not going to find any causation or really connect a whole bunch of dots as to why we are experiencing this kind of dissonance within ourselves. It's fake news being such a predominant phrase in media today, and is it legitimate, or is it just a term used to kind of soothe the wound or the burn of a feeling of cognitive dissonance when we're exposed to different viewpoints or contrary information? And then where do we as a society, where do we as a society go, and how do we grow from this? It's a very much bigger question than really I was expecting to be thinking and getting to for just looking for correlations, but there's a lot of where to go from here, and it's quite exciting. So here are the references from my from the articles referenced in case further reading is wanted to do based on them. Again, my name is Jordan Bedford, and I am working on a correlation study involving the fake news warnings and trust and mistrust in our media. Thank you.